In 1896, a kingdom that no European map acknowledged assembled 100,000 warriors and defeated an entire imperial army in a single day. The victory was so complete, so terrifying to colonial powers, that it was systematically erased from history books for over a century. Today, we're telling the story of Adwa, the battle that proved African nations could not be conquered, and why the Western world worked so desperately hard to forget it ever happened. This is the story of Emperor Menelik II, a man who outmaneuvered empires, unified a nation, and changed the course of African history. But first, we need to understand the world he inherited. A world drowning in colonialism, divided by deception, and on the brink of complete domination. Picture Ethiopia in the 1880s. This is not a land that appeared suddenly on European maps. Ethiopia carried the weight of 3,000 years of history. It was a kingdom that had survived Arab expansion, Islamic conquest, and European interference through cunning, isolation, and an unbreakable will. Ancient Aksumite blood still coursed through Ethiopian veins. They had written law, trade routes that spanned continents, and a sovereignty that stretched back to the time of Solomon himself. But by 1880, the walls were cracking. Europe had drawn its lines across Africa with brutal precision. The Berlin Conference of 1884 had carved an entire continent like a roasted animal at a dinner table, and Ethiopia sat directly in the crosshairs. France controlled the West, Britain controlled the East and South, and Italy, hungry, humiliated by its weakness compared to other European powers, saw an opportunity. Italy had already seized Eritrea to the north. Now they wanted Ethiopia. They wanted its resources, its strategic location, its trade monopoly. More than that, they wanted to prove to the world that Italy could build an empire, that Italians could conquer and rule just like the British and French. What they didn't understand was that they were walking into a trap set by a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. For 400 years, the slave trade had decimated African populations. Millions of people, ripped from their homes, their families destroyed, their cultures fractured. Traditional power structures had been destabilized. European rifles flooded into the continent like water through a broken dam. And now Italy was moving in. But they didn't move through direct conquest. They moved through deception. In 1889, Italian negotiators presented Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II with the Treaty of Wuchale. The document appeared straightforward. Italy would recognize Ethiopian sovereignty in exchange for trade rights, a fair deal between two nations. But there was something hidden inside the language, something deliberately placed like a knife in the dark. The Italian version claimed Ethiopia was an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version said no such thing. When Menelik II read those two versions side by side, he understood immediately what had happened. Italy had tried to colonize Ethiopia through a forged document. They had tried to make Ethiopia a colony through the sleight of hand of language itself. European generals laughed at the thought of Ethiopian resistance. In their minds, the mathematics of conquest were simple. They had machine guns. They had modern artillery. They had the certainty, unshakable and absolute, of racial superiority. Ethiopian forces used primarily rifles and traditional weapons. The gap seemed insurmountable. African warriors against European military discipline and industrial technology. The outcome seemed predetermined, written in the language of power itself. General Oreste Baratieri commanded Italian forces with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. He believed that African warriors, no matter how numerous, could not stand against European military sophistication. Perhaps they could fight. Perhaps they could be brave. But they could not win. It was impossible. The laws of history, the laws of civilization, made it so. Italian newspapers had already begun celebrating. They wrote of glorious conquest, of Italian banners flying over African cities. Rome prepared monuments to colonial triumph. They carved the narrative before the battle was even fought. But Baratieri had made a calculation error, a fatal one. He did not understand his opponent. He did not understand that for years, Emperor Menelik II had been preparing for precisely this moment with the precision of a chess master who sees 10 moves ahead. What Italy did not know, what Europe desperately tried to ignore, was the scope of Menelik's preparation. This was not a spontaneous response to invasion. This was strategy refined over decades. Menelik II had purchased weapons from France, from Russia, and even from Italy itself through intermediaries who understood that weapons manufacturers care only about profit, not politics. He had spent years unifying rival ethnic groups and kingdoms that had feuded for generations. Oromo cavalry units that had once been enemies now rode under the same banner. Amhara soldiers stood beside Guraj fighters. Tigrayans who had once competed for power now coordinated strategy. The man had done something that Europe said was impossible. He had unified Africa. Beyond the military preparation, Menelik had done something more sophisticated still. He had proven that African nations could diplomatically outmaneuver European powers. While Italy assumed that military superiority would be the decisive factor, Menelik was playing a deeper game. A game involving diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the fundamental understanding that unity could transform a nation from vulnerable to invincible. He had sent emissaries across the continent, forging alliances, securing commitments. He had studied his enemy with the intensity of a scholar. He understood European military tactics not as an inferior trying to copy his betters, but as a strategic mind analyzing an opponent's strengths and weaknesses. And he had identified something crucial. European military doctrine assumed a certain type of warfare, a certain type of opponent. Menelik would give them neither. As 1895 turned into 1896, and Italian forces began their advance into Ethiopian territory, Emperor Menelik II issued a call to war. What happened in response shocked the world and proved that his years of preparation had not been in vain. From every corner of Ethiopia, warriors mobilized. This was not a desperate scrambling of forces. This was the systematic activation of a unified military apparatus. Regional chiefs, who had once been rivals, answered the emperor's summons. Peasants became soldiers. Merchants became supply lines. Entire communities contributed weapons, supplies, and provisions. Families sent their sons and brothers knowing that what was at stake was not merely a battle, but the very existence of their nation as a free people. By early 1896, the numbers had become staggering. Approximately 100,000 warriors had assembled, the largest military force that Africa had mustered in centuries. Some historians place the number even higher, at 120,000. To put this in perspective, the Italian army had only 17,000 soldiers in the entire theater. The disparity was not a minor disadvantage, it was a chasm. And yet, this alone did not guarantee victory. Numbers alone never do. What made this army different was what Menelik had built beneath those numbers. This was not a collection of brave but disorganized warriors. This was a coordinated, supplied, unified force, commanded by a military genius who understood both the traditional warfare of Ethiopia and the modern tactics of Europe. Menelik had studied his enemy and prepared with a precision that would have impressed any European general, had that general been willing to admit that an African mind could achieve such sophistication. Italian forces pushed forward through Ethiopian territory, expecting scattered resistance, warriors charging bravely but disorganized, an army that could be defeated through superior European tactics. Instead, they marched directly into something they had not anticipated. They marched into the path of 100,000 warriors united under a single vision: the defense of their nation. Menelik positioned his forces near the town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia, a place that would transform from a geographical location into a symbol of African resistance and triumph. The Ethiopian army encircled Italian positions. The terrain that the Italians thought would be their advantage became a labyrinth that only their opponents understood. On March 1, 1896, the armies collided. What happened on that day was not a fluke. It was not luck or chance. It was the inevitable result of preparation, strategy, and the will of a people determined to remain free. The battle raged for hours. Italian soldiers, expecting a quick victory, found themselves surrounded. Their technological advantage, rifles, artillery, modern weapons, meant nothing when they were isolated and outnumbered by an enemy that knew every stone of the battlefield. Ethiopian warriors attacked with coordinated precision. Units moved in unison. The supposedly primitive African army that European commanders had mocked and dismissed fought with sophistication and strategy that proved the entire colonial narrative to be a lie. By the end of that single day, approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers were killed or wounded. Thousands more were captured. General Baratieri himself was forced to flee in humiliation. The Italian army, which had marched into Ethiopia expecting conquest, retreated in defeat. Ethiopia had defeated a European empire. An African nation had beaten a colonial power in direct military confrontation. The impossible had become reality. The Treaty of Addis Ababa in 1896 formally recognized Ethiopian independence. Ethiopia became the only African nation to maintain sovereignty during the entire colonial era. This should have been celebrated across continents. It should have been taught in schools worldwide. It should have been remembered as the pivotal moment when colonized people proved they could not be conquered. Instead, it was systematically erased. Western history books barely mentioned Adwa. When they did acknowledge it, they minimized it, portrayed it as a fluke, or credited Italian restraint rather than Ethiopian superiority. Italian historians rewrote narratives to preserve national pride. European powers, embarrassed and threatened by the implications of an African victory, worked deliberately to ensure that Adwa remained unknown outside of Ethiopia and Pan-African circles. The reason was simple and terrifying to those in power. If Ethiopia could defeat Italy, then perhaps other African nations could resist. Perhaps the entire justification for colonialism, that Europeans were naturally superior, that conquest was inevitable and justified, was a lie. That thought was more dangerous than any army. For over a century, generations of black people across the diaspora were never taught that an African empire had defeated a European colonial power. They were taught that Africa was conquered, colonized, and dominated. They were taught a narrative of helplessness that became internalized, passed down like inherited trauma. Meanwhile, Ethiopians, rooted in knowledge of Adwa, built a national consciousness that colonialism could never fully penetrate. The flag of Ethiopia, red, gold, and green, became a symbol of African independence and liberation. When Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois looked for proof that African nations could resist and triumph, they pointed to Adwa. It inspired independence movements across the 20th century. But for most of the African diaspora, this history remained hidden. Until now. When Adwa is revealed, when this history surfaces, it changes everything. It proves that resistance happened. It proves that African peoples were not passively conquered, but actively fought back. It proves that the colonial narrative of inevitable European triumph and African inferiority was always a lie told by those in power to justify what they had taken. Your ancestors were not helpless. They were strategists, warriors, and visionaries, and the world worked very hard to make sure you never knew it. The story of Adwa is not just history. It is reclamation. It is the act of taking back narratives that were stolen, and it is proof that liberation has always been possible.